technical difficulty on my end, but thanks everybody for joining. And I really want this to be mainly a Q&A opportunity. We're pretty late in the cycle, just to kind of wood shop questions around that people may have or problems that you're running into with your coordinated campaigns. And I'll kind of go with an overview. So go ahead and go. Next slide. So the first thing we want to talk about is the working with the national committees. So each one of our committees nowadays are very different, and they're all going to kind of, we're going to approach them all differently. I'm going to add, and I'm going to talk about the DNC, as well. First of all, the DCCC. So the DCCC is the one that, frankly, they don't want to play well with others. They don't play nice with the other committees, and they barely want to play with the state parties. We can all, you give Shonda a call if you want to really talk about how the DCCC can be difficult, but they're very tight with their money. So they're not going to really want to be part of and parcel of your coordinated campaign. They're going to want to handle their piece. They're going to want to be very tight with what they spend it on, where the money goes, and we all feel this when we do the MOU process with these guys. They're the ones that are going to want to be very exact about their accounts, where the money goes into the account, and how that money goes out. And the most important thing with your relationship with the DCCC is just from your compliance and your accounting standpoint. You've got to have somebody, and I have somebody on my staff that we assign every year just to do kind of DCCC interface, where because what the interface is basically moving money. If they're in your states, you should view them as they're taking a piece. I mean, there will be a congressional district that is going to be a GOTB. There's going to be communication. They're going to be handled. But that's it. They're not going to be any other pieces. They're not going to buy in to help out other places, and they're going to be very strict about what goes on. But at the end of the day, the good thing about this with the DTRIP is all the things that you need to have happening are happening in one particular congressional district. And your job is going to be to keep track of the money, keep your controls, and keep things moving. DSCC. DSCC has changed a lot in the last 4 or 5 cycles. Nowadays, you're going to have some of you are going to be in states where the DSCC is going to be the driver. If you've got a Senate race, it's Louisiana, it's some Arkansas, it's Georgia, it's North Carolina. They're going to be the ones, they're going to want to drive the train. And my best advice is to work closely with them. All the guys that are there, Paul Dunn did the coordinated campaign in Colorado. Guy Cecil comes from doing coordinated campaign backgrounds from way back in the day. They all kind of get this and understand. Jen O'Malley Dillon is now advising them. They understand, and they can, in many ways, fund an entire coordinated in a lot of these states. And you just need to, and I advise, and I said this when we did this presentation in Columbia, figure out what your piece and your role is going to be as a state party. And what can you work with them that's a leave behind that's going to help your state party moving forward. I mean, whether it's going to be data enhancement, extra comms people that get experience in your state. I mean, there's going to be something that you can work with the DS on that's going to, one, benefit everybody and also act as a leave behind. DGA. The thing about the DGA is, they're not as, a big as money committee as the DS, but they are a big player. I've found with the DGA they're very much a la carte. You should figure out ways to go to the DGA with what you need and an argument of why you need it and why it's going to help the statewide ticket, where you have governor's races, and kind of work with them on an ongoing basis. I have a really great relationship with the DGA, and it's basically one of those where we can go to them and say, hey, we need to get X done, and they do it, as long as you've got a good valid argument behind it. And understanding that you can't go to the DGA, unlike the DSCC, and say, look, we don't have funding for a coordinated campaign, we need you to fund it. They don't come to the table like that, unlike the DSCC, which is basically going to try and do that. And lastly, the DNC. I don't think we should forget about the DNC from a coordinated campaign perspective. You know, for example, they've hired our voter protection director here in Florida. I'll probably end up asking them for some additional help. You know, much like the DGA, I think if there are things that you can get that are in line with what the DNC's mission is currently is, data, again, voter protection, maybe some GOTV needs. I think be prepared to make a sound, crisp argument to the DNC, particularly for those of us like Florida where we're going to be starving for federal dollars, of a way to kind of get even that 15% of, you know, 11 or the 20% on the split that you can match up with some soft dollars. I mean, be prepared to make that kind of argument to the DNC. Next slide. So stakeholder meetings. One reason I was late to this call is I was having my weekly stakeholder meeting with our top of the ticket campaign. You know, by this point in the cycle, you should be doing at least weekly meetings. I mean, weekly calls. At this point, you should have a small group dealing with generally consisting of your top of the ticket campaigns. If you've got multiple statewide campaigns, you should have a representative from each statewide campaign. If you don't have viable statewide races, frankly, I only have one in Florida right now, so we only have one campaign statewide that we're interfacing with. But when we talk to them, we have they're at the table, DGA, other big union folks that are funding. We're talking, you know, every week now. You should also plan to do meetings in person at this stage, and I would recommend once a month. When you get into September, it's going to be every other week. I think the in-person meetings are very important because there's just things you can hash out and do in person that you just can't get done on these conference calls. Now, when we talk about who is involved in these meetings, we do it here in Florida, and I recommend this for other states. We have two different kind of calls each week. One is a funder call, and one is a campaign call. At this stage, you're going to want to be doing weekly calls with your stakeholders or your funders, and that's you know, your teachers unions, your AFSCME, SEIU, trial lawyers if you have them, Donor Alliance. I have those people here. Those are not. It's not necessarily the campaign folks, but it's the folks who are doing your money, and particularly if you have a lot of IE activity in your state, there's going to be a lot of crossover because these are going to be the same people that are funding the IE work. So you don't find yourself directly coordinating with the IEs, but you're obviously speaking to the people that are funding the IEs, and therefore you learn what they're doing. And you're constantly keeping your donors updated so that when you come to September and you need that $100,000 or you need that $250,000, you know, you're not catching people off guard. That's one call that right now I'm doing every 2 weeks. That'll eventually be every week when we get towards the end of our primary is August 26th when we get to the end of August. And then the other meeting is the campaign meeting. That's the meeting you're doing every week with the campaign manager, with your field director, with any other campaigns. You don't necessarily have to have the congressionals involved in this, and I wouldn't recommend it. I meet with them separately, and then I report in to the statewide of what the congressionals are doing, since that is so separate as I kind of talked about earlier. Next slide. Money. So this is a huge deal. Is basically giving people trust that you can handle their money. That's really what a state party is all about. You've probably some of y'all have heard me mention at meetings, you know, the core competency of a state party is managing and handling money, and if you can't do that, then you really can't function because no one's going to give it to you. So you've got to have really good financial controls in place, and you got to figure out what works best for you. A couple of suggestions. So, there's a few ways to do this. Depending if you use QuickBooks or separate accounts, you should consider the idea of separate accounts. Now, your compliance officer is probably going to complain that it costs money. It costs money every time you open an account, and that's bad. But I think having separate accounts, and I usually do a separate federal coordinated account and a separate non-federal coordinated account, just gives donors that much more confidence that they're not paying for you to go to Atlanta and the DNC. They're paying for program. And you can point to, and they can come in and look anytime, hey, this is the coordinated campaign account, this is where the money's going, this is what we're using it for, it's not going into ops, or whatever you call your operating account. I've done that in every coordinated for the last 12 years. And it's just giving folks confidence that their money is going towards the coordinated campaign. Considering having an approval process, usually to the table, on its expenditures over a certain amount. This always depends on the size of your campaign, whether it's $25,000 and above. I wouldn't go smaller than that. You need to be able to obviously make decisions and move money at a lower level. This doesn't include staff payroll. But I think anytime you do a media buy or you do a major piece of mail or anything that is really, really big, you should have some type of approval process. If you've got a major single funder for your coordinated, be it the DS, be it a candidate who's funding it, you should have a process in place like we do here where everything gets, there is somebody on the other side of the equation who is signing off on this before my CFO pays the invoice. Now it should just, we're not talking about 3 people, we're not talking about 2 people, we're really talking about one person that we can go to that's basically the opposite number of your CFO, so that we can say, hey, this is a $50,000 invoice, they say yes, we say yes, it's compliant, gets paid. And you've got a pretty tight approval process in place. Weekly, monthly reporting, we keep everything in QuickBooks. We provide either a campaign or the committee with an accounting every week. We call it a P&L, a profit and loss sheet. And frankly, this is one of those things that after a few weeks, they just say, hey, that's fine, don't stop giving it to me. We get it. You guys are not taking our money. We're spending it correctly, and they basically stop wanting it. It's just something that you should do on the front end, but I will promise you folks won't want it. It's just about building trust. And finally, the best practice is always be open and transparent. I have always told folks that I'm dealing with, they can walk in this office at any time, go back to my compliance office and look at anything we've got. I also remind people that we report every month. We report every quarter. And once people realize that we are, frankly, the most open and transparent organization because we have to be, a lot of those initial trust issues fall away, and you can just kind of get down to the doing business. Next slide. GOTV. So here's kind of we're getting down to it. We've got 125 days to go. This is a good point to be like, who's responsible for doing what? At this point in your coordinated campaign, you should know who's responsible for turning out what voters, be that demographically or geographically. I mentioned the congressional, so I have 3 congressional races going on here in Florida that are hot and targeted and going to have staff and field campaigns. And we know that the DTRIP is responsible in those 3 areas for turning out those voters. And we're kind of dividing up the state that way. Now, there might be a demographic. You may have groups that want to do Hispanic turnout. That you can say, great, go do Hispanic turnout in these areas where we're light. But you should, at this point, know how you're divvying up and who's responsible. And maybe it isn't. You've got one campaign. You've got the DS, for example, and they're funding the whole thing, and they're going to be responsible for turning out every drop-off Democrat. That's fine. You just got to know that, and that's the way you're planning it. Maybe you've got a lot of IE activity in a place like North Carolina. Well, then you're going to be able to figure it out by the public activity that they do, who's doing what voters, and then you've determined where you're going to fill the gaps. At the end of the day, that's kind of what it comes down to for a state party is figuring out probably by Labor Day, what is getting done, what's not getting done, where are the holes. I've got maybe another 30 days to fill them and getting it done. Because after you've planned all this out, I find that plans tend to disintegrate at the first shots of battle and the first budget write-downs. But you continue to fill the holes as long as you can. Next. I think that gets us to questions. You want to go to the next slide?
Awesome. So thanks, Scott. If you have a question for Scott about his presentation and what was covered regarding managing your coordinated campaign, you can type your questions in the questions box, or you can click the raise my hand icon and we will make sure to get you unmuted. Scott, can you talk briefly about what are some of the big challenges that you all have faced with working with your stakeholders on the coordinated?
Sure. I mean, the biggest challenge we find is consensus. I mean, we always have a desire to have a consensus in this business. We want to have everybody, agreeing and move forward, but that's not always possible. You've got, nowadays, with folks that are funding these campaigns, people come to the table with different missions. You're going to have some partners who are very passionate about the Hispanic vote, and that's all they want to do. Well, maybe everybody wants to do that, but no one's, focusing on the African American community. You've got to work with your major stakeholder, whoever be that the candidate or the committee, determine what the strategy is going to be, and it might not necessarily be what some of the stakeholders want it to be, but your job is to work with them and get them bought into what the winning strategy is going to be, and bring them around. Whether that's issues, maybe it's NEA and they want to talk about education, but maybe education just isn't it. Maybe it's got to be about the economy. You need to help them understand why that's the case and why you need to be doing talking about a certain message. That's the biggest challenge I find going forward. That doesn't have to do with money. It's having the money to fund it. I think the second, the more practical challenge I have is the federal, non-federal stuff. By stuff I mean having enough federal money to actually implement program. How do you move things over to non-federal? That is something that's a more of a practical application for everybody that I think we need to understand. I think when you build out your campaigns, everything should be split out. What's federal, what's non-federal, what can be paid on the split, what can be paid 100% non-fed, what can be done leavened, even if you want to even do leavened. And have everything kind of budgeted out that way so that at least you and your compliance staff understand I'm going to need this amount of federal money, and then I got to have a plan to get it. So that's the kind of more that's the concrete challenge of the coordinated, and then the more finesse of the coordinated, the biggest challenge.
Great, thank you. So there are two questions that I think kind of go together. One of them is, what major agenda topics do you go over in your weekly or monthly calls with stakeholders? And that you also mentioned that you meet separately with congressional candidates and separately from statewide races, and kind of what do you kind of cover that's different, or kind of how do you frame those conversations?
Sure. So we, in our weekly, we have a couple things. First, we talk about money. We generally talk about how's fundraising going, what kind of fundraising do we have on tap, what are some things that we need to be doing to help the fundraising succeed. Now, what does that mean? So, who's going to D.C. to meet with NEA to talk about raising money? What kind of email program are we going to run this week that's going to be asking people for money? You don't want to send out a state party email asking for money at the same time that your gubernatorial candidate is sending out an email asking for money, because you're most likely sending it to the same people. where are you doing an event? I had a big event last weekend in Fort Lauderdale. I did not want, obviously, my gubernatorial candidate fundraising at the same time, and they weren't because we had coordinated that. Just generally, what's going on with the fundraising, how's it going, who's doing what and when. Earned media press. That's obviously the other big kind of has to be coordinated, has to be on the same page conversation. Your press people, that means your state party press people and your committee and your campaign press people should be talking every day. Every morning, your comms director and their comms director should be getting on the phone and talking, and that should not be your problem. With the campaign manager and the other big stakeholders, you're going to want to be talking about what's our message this week. We're talking about education. You know, your gubernatorial candidate is doing this kind of event. State party is going to be doing this kind of event. We're doing these op-eds, and this is where we're doing them. Thirdly is the paid media, if you're at that stage yet. What ad is running, who's running it, when are we switching traffic, what are we switching traffic to, what's that message? Are there IEs going, what are the IEs message, what are they doing, are they changing traffic? Lastly is then, field, offices, staff, who's doing what. At this stage, at the summertime, you might not be doing a lot of door knocking, you might be. But, saying, all right, this is kind of what we're doing and where on the field side. Those are kind of the 4 big topics that we cover every week. With the congressionals, vis-a-vis the statewide, so there's a reason I keep them separate. One, they don't play well together. You put them together, and the statewide guy is going to want the congressional guy to do more. Like, why aren't you doing more? You take over all this. If you put the congressional guy is going to be like, well, I don't really want to do anything. I think the statewide guy should do everything. You got to keep them separate, or they won't play well tonight. They just won't play well together. I cover the same, almost have the exact conversation with the congressionals that I have with the statewide, and then I take back what information I need to the statewide group, and then make sure things are all moving together, because they're not going to work. They're not going to work. They're not going to be coordinated together. They have to be coordinated through you. That's it.
Great. There are 2 more questions in our questions box. The next is, not all state parties are created equal, obviously. So how do you establish credibility with stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's all about, kind of trying to figure out what your niche is going to be. So the state party can be, you can be 3 things. You can be ignored, you can be the back office, or you can run program. You want to either run program or be the back office, but mainly you want to be both, so that you're integral to the campaigns and you've got programs that you own. But you've got to be able to sell that. You've got to ask yourself some primary questions. What can the state party do in your state that nobody else can do? Decide the state party, what is your niche? What can you do that's cheaper than any other entity or cheaper than the campaign, so they're going to want to do it through you? What expertise do you have as a state party that you have that nobody else brings to the table? Maybe that's communication, so you've got you can handle the press, you've got really good people, you can do that, the campaign can't. Maybe it's GOTV. You're the only entity that can really pull together a statewide GOTV program, and that's what you're going to do. Maybe it's data, but it's finding what your niche is, finding what it is that you can do that no one else can, what it is that you can do cheaper than anybody else can do it, and you stick to that one thing. I think the biggest trap state parties run into all the time in Florida is just as big as we are, we find the same exact problem, is basically trying to do everything. The coordinated campaigns that we used to do in 96, 98, or 2000 don't exist anymore. The state parties are not the operations for where they put everything in it and then run everything out. It is very much narrowcast, focused on accomplishing 1 or 2 really important strategic goals, not all the strategic goals. That's what I think each state party kind of needs to do to build relevance. Then, of course, you back whatever that niche is up with data. very data heavy, and with a good strategic argument about why you're the best entity to implement that.
Great, thank you. Yep. There's an additional question that I think you might have covered already, but are you doing a joint fundraising with any other committees or campaigns?
We don't have any formal joint fundraising agreement with any other campaigns or committees. I think y'all know what that means. But yes, we are doing joint in that we're helping other campaigns raise money, mainly down the ballot. Our gubernatorial campaign is fairly self-sufficient in raising money. DGA is obviously very self-sufficient in raising money, but I have a lot of other candidates, my state legislative candidates in particular, state senate, state house, that we are active in helping them raise money for their campaigns.
Wonderful. We have 2 additional questions. There are lots of questions out there today. How do state house and state senate races fit into the coordinated? Are they just invited to regular meetings, or is there a representative? Kind of what's their role?
Sure. So one, no, they're not invited to meetings. They're too tiny. In almost any state, for example, in Florida, I've got 120 houses. So they're less than 1/10 or 1/100th of the state. Very little pockets of votes. Their budgets are $400,000. The gubernatorial campaign budget is between $40 and $50 million. So it doesn't make sense to really bring them in. What we do, we make sure, one, from a GOTV standpoint, whether it's a vote by mail or early vote, here, like we're all working off the same targets. So the legislative races don't have different targets for, we got to sign these are our vote by mail sign up targets, or these are early vote. They're all going to have the same targets as the statewide. So that's make sure that everybody's talking to everybody else. Even their persuasion targets are almost all the same. The way we basically build here our statewide program around these legislative races. It's almost like if you think of water in a flood going around rocks that are sticking up. They just go all around it, but you have these little islands in these legislative races where we're able to put in money because there's specific activity going on there. In Florida, like a lot of states that have bad redistricting, we frankly don't have that many targeted races. I'll have about 10 state house races, which is less than 10% of my state house, and I'll only have 2, maybe 3 state senate races, which is, again, less than 10%. We'll build a program in South Florida that will basically be around those little house races, but within those house races, we just ensure that they're basically conducting the same activity, much like the DCCC, as the statewide coordinated campaign. If you're able to get big enough, and I don't know who's got this much money, because I certainly don't have it here, then you can kind of go in and build on top in those places, but I really don't. We're kind of more like we're building around it. And it's all about you use your voter file. If you've got everybody on the band, which I'm sure everyone does, you use your file to make sure that each of those little committees are working off the same sheet of music and doing the same thing. So next question.
Wonderful. So there's a question regarding funding for the coordinated funding through county parties in this person's example, and they have buy-in for staff and mail, but they're about to start county chair calls. Do you have any advice for balancing and making sure that every partner feels heard without, kind of 1 or 2 people kind of taking over the conversation if you're trying to kind of spread a wide net and be inclusive of your county party folks?
Yeah, and this is that's a really good question. It's very unique to every state, the whole county party issue. For example, in Louisiana, we didn't have any real parish committees. They just didn't really exist. But in a place like New Jersey, half your program will actually run through your county parties. So every state's going to be unique in dealing with basically your local party structures. Here in Florida, we do a monthly call with all our county chairs where we try to give them direction on kind of what the overall overarching strategy is. And by overarching, I mean like we give them like 3 specific tasks that we're working on at that particular moment in time, whether it's, you know, vote by mail requests that are going to start, or we're doing voter registration right now, or, you know, we're getting ready for early vote, to try to be very big picture with them to make sure they're kind of all kind of working to the big picture strategy. And they all have different personalities. I mean, we do just a monthly call. We don't do a weekly. You know, we call it when you let everybody have their say, let everybody talk. Most, I find 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a few malcontents, but you'll be able to, if you're clear and crisp on your strategy, that say vote by mail requests are going to win or lose this election. This is why, and you give them the numbers. All of these local folks come around because they understand that, and that's how we handle it here.
Great, thanks, Scott. And if there are any additional questions, you all can type in the questions box or click the raise my hand icon to get yourself unmuted. While we're waiting on additional questions in the questions box, just wanted to remind you that there will be an evaluation coming to your inbox shortly after we wrap the webinar today. Please take an opportunity to fill it in and give us your feedback on today's webinar, as well as any suggestions that you might have for future webinars, any follow-up information or questions that you have, and we'll make sure to get some information and resources out to you. Wonderful. So there don't look to be any additional questions in the questions box. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time. Do you have any parting thoughts for us?
Good luck, everybody. I think, as I tell my own folks, 2014 is not 2010. Much different environment out there. I think we've got some excellent opportunities. We keep our head up and keep moving forward. And I am always available. Whereas I travel a lot, I do want folks to know they can always pick up the phone and call here in Tallahassee. You don't have to come to Tallahassee, but you can certainly call me.
Awesome. Well, thank you again to Scott Arceneaux, the Executive Director for the Florida Democratic Party, for sharing his insights with us on coordinated campaign management. Thank you to all of you for joining. We hope that you have a fantastic 4th of July weekend, and we will talk to you again next week. Thanks, everyone.